When describing linear warfare, the days when musket-wielding soldiers would line up shoulder to shoulder and shoot at each other, I often describe it as a necessary madness. Madness because, it's guys standing upright in lines and shooting at each other without bothering to take any cover. And necessary because, as crazy as it seems to our modern minds, it was actually one of the most efficient and even practical ways for these armies to wage war for a wide variety of reasons. And one of those reasons was because horses exist. Well, mounted soldiers, guys on those horses. Cavalry, especially heavy cavalry, dominated European battlefields for most of history. And while my focus here is early modern, musket-wielding soldiers, most of what I'm saying in this video will apply for most of human history, from antiquity, swords and spears, up to the advent of modern breech rather than muzzle-loading firearms. That's when things start to get kind of weird, though. We're going to focus on before that time period. The term heavy cavalry is a pretty literal one. These units consisted of horses that were large, heavy, and strong, carrying on their backs very large, heavy, and strong men. They were equipped with things, the men, that is, not the horses, they were equipped with things like heavy cavalry sabers, lances, carbines, and pistols, and many of them wore armor long after most of the army had gotten rid of it. I go into more detail about all that in my video about cavalry of the Napoleonic era if you'd like to learn more about those classifications and their equipment and the like. Another term you may see sometimes is shock cavalry or shock tactics, which again is pretty straightforward. Heavy cavalry would form up and charge directly into the enemy, slamming into infantry with terrifying force and weight, causing the enemy to collapse and flee. Here's a popular clip of something like that happening. I think it was either an accident when filming a movie or maybe just a really brave stuntman, but it's a good way to just see that force. Except in real life, of course, the cavalry isn't going to hit one at a time like this. They're all going to hit at once, and the horsemen are going to be as close to knee in their line as they can get. And of course, they're also not just going to stop there to fight in hand-to-hand with the infantry when they ride up to the enemy. They're going to keep on going. They're going to ride through the line like that first guy did. That's the idea, at least. But hold on. Earlier I said that one of the big reasons why soldiers were fighting in these formations and these lines to start with was because of cavalry. So what sense does it make if cavalry is also one of the best ways to break down those formations? Well, if you're a simple infantryman on the ground and you're going up one-on-one against the cavalryman, you're already starting off at something of a disadvantage, odds are. The horse is larger, it has speed, there's a guy who's higher up than you are, there's all sorts of things like that. The best chance as an infantryman that you're going to have is numbers and presenting a solid front. If the infantry are all spread around loosely with large gaps between them and whatnot, it ensures that most of those fights, when the cavalry come to you, they're going to be one-on-one. And it provides gaps, openings, where the enemy, or the cavalry, can use their speed advantage. They don't have to rush bodily into you, they can ride right to the side and then swipe down from above without ever stopping, just riding right on through to the other side, where then they can reform, turn around, and then do it again. Now, it may not be perfect, battlefield conditions rarely are, but if the infantry is going to stand a chance against that charge, they need to be able to present a solid line of steel with the enemy. And I really wish that I had my bayonet right now to emphasize the point, but imagine something like 18 inches of pointy, 18 inches of steel being right in your face right here. In earlier time periods, it was a line of pikes, or a shield wall with protruding spears. It's all serving the same basic function. You create a line, like a solid fence or a wall of steel protruding, a line of death. And it's very difficult to convince a horse to outright kill itself by running headlong into those bayonets. Now, it is possible, I'm pretty sure, but even after that, then you still have to convince the man riding on the horse to do the same thing. Although, given the nature of war, it may actually be easier to convince the man of a glorious death than the animal. But even if the horse manages to ram into the line without being skewered, it's not just this. There's going to be another bayonet right behind the first one, and possibly more yet along the side, down below, all over the place. It's like a whole, hedgehog type thing that you're running into there. When infantry are in close order, they're all able to help each other. The enemy moves to strike or block a blow from one soldier, well then they're going to get hit from the side by another. Of course, even if the cavalry does die, they run in and the horses do get skewered by that line of bayonets, it's still having a wall of horse flesh crashing into a body of men. It's still going to do a lot of damage. It may even break apart the formation if enough horses are ramming into them at the same time. Again, it's a question of how many cavalry are you willing to sacrifice, and are they willing to sacrifice themselves in order to break that formation, in order to actually get through that line. Keeping in mind also that even for the most cold-hearted of commanders, cavalry are typically far more valuable and lesser in number than the infantry are, and so a one-to-one exchange like that, if there's a powerful line of infantry and you commit a bunch of heavy cavalry to smash into them and both units end up dying, it's probably in the other army's favor as opposed to yours. But for the infantry's part, for if you're on the ground, you're not really going to care about all this arithmetic of like, all right, well, he'll kill me, but I'll kill him, and that's a better exchange. You're not going to care about that. You don't want to have to ask yourselves whether or not the enemy is willing to take the chance of rushing into your bayonets to begin with. That brings us to the second really big reason why fighting in lines is so important, at least again for musket-wielding armies, and that is firepower. If a unit of cavalry is charging you, you want to have as many guns as you can trained on them. When you're standing shoulder to shoulder with multiple ranks of guns all directed in the same direction, you can get a lot more balls flying down that range than if you were dealing with a smaller number of men all spread out in the same space. If the infantry are in close order like that, then for every one horse, there might be 2, 4, even 6 or more muskets in that same amount of space, roughly speaking at least. And if they can hold their fire until the last moment when the cavalry is right up on them, then they can unleash a devastating volley, all firing at once, that would not only kill off that front line and more, but disrupt whatever happens to survive enough that the charge might just break apart outright and they're going to turn tail and flee the other way. Or, if the cavalry do manage to keep the charge going, well then, boom, they've lost a lot of men, and now they're coming up against that aforementioned row of pointy. And it's for that reason that even when we're talking about heavy cavalry, shock forces, they never really want to try and go up one for one against a well-positioned, dressed line of enemy infantry. Cavalry want to try and get around the flanks, to exploit gaps in an enemy's line, and to hit them where they don't have the advantages of that firepower and that row of bayonets and whatnot. They want to try and hit them in other positions. And thus we have another formation for infantry called the square, which is when the line would fold in on itself like so. And if you're interested in learning more about the infantry square, I have a dedicated video all about how it worked and how it could be beaten, all the mechanics involved, things like that, which you can go and see after this one, of course. A big potential use for the cavalry was to keep it in reserve, not so much as the beginning force, but something that you use when the opportunity arises. You want to deploy the cavalry after your infantry fighting in that traditional linear formation. After they do their work, then you send in the cavalry. It's for when an enemy formation, they're already beginning to lose their cohesion, aka their line is starting to thin out from casualties, and maybe that line is starting to lose its shape. There are gaps, little gaps beginning to open up in the line, things like that. When the enemy is in that sort of position, after they've been fighting your infantry for some time, then you send in the cavalry, they rush in, they hit them fast and hard, and they break them apart before they have a chance to dress their line, reform, and again, make that stand. Hitting a line of infantry that's willing to stand its ground, that's suicidal. But if you can hit them when they're already wavering and they're going to and you're going to force them to flee, well, when the line is broken, that's when cavalry is at its deadliest. Which in turn, I think, speaks to another advantage of infantry being in close order lines to begin with, being that in a way it's actually easier for them to maneuver that way. When the soldiers are spread out, large gaps in between them and everything, it can be very difficult to coordinate them in these very long, elongated formations, these very large formations, while also maintaining that level of spacing. They might, start to warp and bend and whatnot when you're trying to get, 50 or 100 guys to march forward at the same time, but they're all spread out, if that makes any sense. Whereas when the men are already standing, nice and tight together, shoulder to shoulder, well then you can have them march, you can have them wheel, reform their lines far more quickly and efficiently without having to worry about the line becoming misshapen and thus opening up any weak points. If I'm shoulder to shoulder with 2 guys on either side, well, I know where I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to be between them. But Maneuverability on an 18th century battlefield would warrant a topic of video all its own, so we'll save that for another day. It's also important to remember that when we're talking about how historical armies fought, that these shoulder-to-shoulder lines weren't the be-all end-all. Close order combat was only one of a myriad of different techniques available to military leaders, which could all be employed depending on the individual circumstances and situations that these armies are facing. During the American War of Independence, for example, and really most combat in North America during this time period, there really weren't large numbers of heavy cavalry on the field like you might see in Europe. Add to that the fact that the terrain is regularly broken up, well then light infantry tactics, where men were fighting behind cover with larger intervals between them, was actually quite common in that part of the world. And during the Napoleonic Wars, back over on those traditional European battlefields, the British Army, and many others besides, like the French, were still making ample use of skirmishers, and in the British case especially riflemen, fighting in very loose order, for the rifles it was called chain order, using cover and taking carefully aimed shots at their opponents. But, if, for example, those skirmishers are coming across, flat open ground and an enemy unit of cavalry is sighted, well then, you guessed it, they're going to either fall back to the security offered by those traditional infantry fighting in shoulder-to-shoulder lines, or the skirmishers are going to form a line themselves, usually with sword bayonets. It's the same thing, just a longer bayonet, basically. It's all just a giant, deadly game of rock, paper, scissors in that way. Like I said, at first glance, seeing thousands of soldiers just standing in nice, neat, and orderly rows and marching up to one another, it looks like madness, absolute insanity. But there was a logic to it that not only justified such military thinking, but necessitated it. It wasn't because they were stupid or arrogant, pretentious, even that they were overly zealous or brave in a way that, soldiers of any other time period weren't. Simply put, in certain situations, this was simply the most efficient way for them to do things. Linear warfare may look to us like a madness, but it was a necessary madness. And the presence of cavalry was only one of a wide variety of reasons why. Now, before my usual sign-off, I wanted to cover one last reason why lining up in close order formations was so important to 18th century combat, as brought to us by this video's sponsor, Exter.
Heavy cavalry spotted to the front, sir.
The battalion shall form square!
Wait a moment, sir. Something's funny. I don't see any lancers or sabers in their line, sir. They seem totally unarmed. They're only carrying small, contactless payment machines. What could it mean, sir? Have the enemy formed a troop of mounted waitstaff?
By God, this is no mere cavalry charge. They're preparing a mass RFID theft. Those machines will cut straight through our knapsacks and steal our payment card information. Thank heavens we've spotted it, else we'd have our guineas picked before we even knew it. The battalion shall move from traditional bifolds into Exter wallets. Right, lads, you heard the officer. Remember your Exter wallets provide RFID protection. Follow my lead and you will financially survive this battle.
Of course, a most elegant play, sir. Parliament pattern wallets from Exter are half the size of the old Longland bifold patterns, and they still carry up to 12 cards each plus cash.
And when the time comes for us to decide this battle, they'll provide us with quick and easy card access. Ensure the men are well prepared to deploy on my mark with those buttons.
Oh no!
What is it, lad?
Sergeant, I can't find my Exter wallet. It must have fallen out of my pack on the march.
Well, thank goodness for Exter's solar-powered tracking devices. Quickly, lad, get out your phone and figure out where it is. We'll send a drummer for it.
Oh, of course. Thank you, Sergeant. It looks like it's still fully charged after getting a couple hours of sunlight. A glorious day for our environmentally friendly Italian leather Exter wallet, sir. Oh, and one more thing, sir.
The enemy is nearly upon us, man. What is it?
Well, sir, I still have to mention that during the Valentine's Day sale, going on now until February 14th, that you can get up to 35% off your order with Exter by following the link in the description and using code BrandonF. But, well, I can't think of a good way to integrate that smoothly into the bit we've already got going here, so, I love you, sir.
Thank you to Exter for sponsoring this video. Follow the link below and use code BrandonF for up to 35% off this Valentine's Day sale.
Thank you all for watching, and most particularly to those nobly inclined persons who support my work on Patreon. You may join their illustrious ranks for as little as $1 a month and become one of the pillars of this channel upon which all of my work relies. And remember, if you'd rather not spend the cash, another excellent way to support this content would be to watch my videos early on recap podcast, where I occasionally even publish some exclusive content as well. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants.